so we can finish hopefully by 11:30, and then we'll talk about the final exam, maybe 11:35. I will give you a chance if you have a quick question, anybody.
Kellen said she was going to be a few minutes late.
Okay, thank you. All right, we did the intro material of chapter 17 that included the DIME acronym, which was just a little memory device to remember the 4 instruments that our nation has when it comes to national security. And I said you probably need to know those, and you will. So what we're going to look at today, the rest of the chapter deals with the our foreign and defense policy today and where it came from. A closer look at the military dimension of our national security policy, and then a closer look at the economic dimension of our national security. And these are basically the 3, well, they're the 3 big outline sections in chapter 17. For the most part, from the time we became a nation in 1787 until the beginning of World War I, we pretty much were an isolationist country. George Washington, in his farewell address, talked about that we should avoid all entangling alliances with foreign powers, and we pretty much did that. Every now and then we would deal with some foreign adversaries when it came to them interacting with nations in our hemisphere. In other words, we didn't really go to Europe or Africa or Asia for any foreign conflicts. But if a country from Europe or Asia came over and was interfering or bullying a nation in North or South America or the Western Hemisphere, we would intervene. And the beginning of this was the Monroe Doctrine in 1823 when James Monroe was the president. This doctrine basically warned Europe to stay out of the affairs of the Western Hemisphere. So during the 19th century, our only conflicts were with nations that were in North and South America. We continued to move westward, which caused us to have to deal with France and Spain and England still. We began to expand commercially in the late 19th century, which affected our foreign policy. Another thing that was another policy that came into effect was the good neighbor policy. which dealt with Latin America, and then we had an open door policy for China. But other than those things, we really didn't have much interaction in foreign policy, foreign affairs. A couple of other things sprouted up in the 20th century. During our man Teddy Roosevelt's time, he expanded the Monroe Doctrine with the Roosevelt Corollary, which basically said the United States has a right to intervene in the affairs of our neighbors to the south, in South America. We basically became a policeman for the Western Hemisphere. And then during President Truman's time, we saw the institution of the Truman Doctrine, in which we would follow a policy of containment to try to contain and slow down the spread of communism. We'll talk more about that here in a little bit. Actually, this is leading into a broader discussion of containment. But first, Truman became president during World War II when Franklin Roosevelt died during his 4th term. Truman became president and the war soon ended. He was the president who was responsible for the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs in Japan, which brought a speedily end to the war. At the end of the war, we were allies with Russia and Britain. But after World War II, with the defeat of Germany and the defeat of Japan, Russia became the dominant communist power, and we entered into a period of what is known as the Cold War. So our allies during the end of World War II, our ally Russia, or actually the USSR, United Socialist States Republic, became our chief opponent, and we entered into a Cold War with them, which is a war where there's no fighting. It's simply a tension below the surface that there are 2 competing political ideologies, in this case, the United States and democracy, and the USSR and communism. And at the end of World War II, the world political spectrum set up to where there was 2 superpowers, us and Russia. And so that began the Cold War. So the USSR, under the leadership of Stalin, began to acquire territory. There were 15 member nations in the USSR, 14 others along with Russia, and they started to move westward. And so Truman enacted this containment policy. This is all described in your textbook on 508 and 509. And the containment theory was this: if Russia or China, as the case, if they, because China was still a big communist power, but the USSR emerged as the superpower. But if both of them started to expand and basically annex other countries and make them a part of them. So we're using this visual here. If China goes in and invades Korea and takes over Korea, then the next country next to Korea, Vietnam, will fall, and then Laos will fall. And this came to be known as the domino theory. The seizing of one country will cause a domino effect, so that the countries bordering these countries will fall like dominoes. So as the USSR moved to the west, and they started to, I think, go into Poland and then to Germany, the United States reacted, and they split Germany into East and West Germany. East Germany was communist controlled. West Germany was, of course, aligned with the United States. And there was a line that divided Germany, and it went through the capital of Berlin. So you had you had a wall that was built, and people in East Germany, or I'm sorry, those who lived in East Berlin, there were families that got separated in Berlin, as well as the rest of the country. So if Russia or China invaded a country and took it over, we acted to stop them. So China started to move south and started to take over North Korea. So we went in and we helped South Korea establish a democracy. China started to move into Vietnam in the north. We went into Vietnam in the south. This is what containment is. As communism tries to spread, we spread democracy to contain it. Because if we don't, all of these countries will fall like dominoes. Now, you need to make sure you highlight or write yourself a note. The domino theory will be one of the major questions on the test. I think you're going to like this test. It's going to be a lot shorter, but you'll have to insert yourself a lot more than usual. So that was containment. I've got to get speeded up here so we can finish this chapter. Eventually, the excuse me. Eventually, the USSR fell in 1989, and the Berlin Wall came down, and we became basically the major superpower on the planet. No longer was the world in a bipolar situation, but it was a unipolar situation for a while. When George Bush Sr. became president, he espoused this idea of multilateralism. This is the approach to where if there is instead of the United States acting to contain a country by itself, if there is an invasion by one country into another, then it will be an international effort, a multi-effort of many nations to stop the invading nation. George Bush really espoused this. He called for a new world order in which the United States was no longer the, quote, world's policeman, but instead countries would work together, and especially countries that were in the UN or in NATO. And this was put to the test in 1990 when Iraq invaded Kuwait in the Gulf War. And with the US leading the way, it was over, and the fighting was over in 4 days. After that war, Bush's approval rating went to 90%. Things were looking good for him. All right. Clinton, Bill Clinton had his own similar issue with Serbia and Bosnia in the 1990s. Again, that was a multilateralism affair. While there's a lot of advantages to this, there were some cons. There were some setbacks to it, or some drawbacks. A lot of the conflicts, like the Serbian and Bosnian conflict, were centuries old conflict. They were ethnic conflicts. And so winning maybe a short-term war is not going to solve the long-term problems that have deep roots. There's also regional conflicts. There are factions within nations that conflict. An example in the Muslim world would be Sunni Muslims versus Shiite Muslims. That leads to another aspect of the drawback of multilateralism is a lot of these disputes are religious. And so going in and maybe helping stop a religious war is just going to be a temporary fix. It's going to be a Band-Aid. The issues are just too deep-seated. As we moved into the 21st century, we moved into a new era of terrorism. The Cold War was ended at the end of 1980s. And so there was only about a decade of multilateralism, and we entered into a new time in the 21st century with terrorism, and it began the war on terror. This was our central focus in America. Excuse me. And it has been for the last 2 decades. The war on terror was a new kind of war. We're going to look at the different types of war here in a moment. But out of this time came the Bush Doctrine. This is where President Bush, Little George, after 9/11, said that we are not going to wait for another country to attack us. If we have reason to believe, if we have good reasons to believe that another country is plotting against us, we will preemptively strike so that they cannot strike us. Today, we still have basically front and center a war on terror, but instead of with countries, it started with 9/11, where we are fighting against groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and it's a much more challenging type of warfare. Which leads us to the second big section, which is the military dimension of our national security. This begins on the bottom of page 515, and the bulk of this material is the different types of war that we have waged as a country since our founding until today. There were conventional wars throughout the throughout the end of the 18th century, throughout the 19th century, and into the beginning of the 20th century with World War I and World War II, and probably the Korean War. Conventional wars are where you have regular military soldiers from different countries fighting. They are separated by from the public. In other words, the wars are waged away from major population centers. There may be small villages like there was in World War II that are, and there were some big cities, but for the most part, these wars are conventional warfare is usually fought away from civilians. They use heavy artillery. They get a lot of logistical support, and this is something that is a part of the government. The military branches use to fight a conventional war. A conventional war usually has a front line where the warfare is fought. That changed with the Vietnam War specifically, although you could find other skirmishes of unconventional war, or what we would call guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare comes from a Spanish word that means a small war. This does not have large armies, but it has small units of not military trained soldiers, but it could be military people. It could be freedom fighters, they might be called. It could be it could be just any kind of group of people that is disgruntled, and they may have military training, they may not. They are highly mobile because they're smaller. They don't need a lot of logistical support. They tend to blend in with the public, and so they don't try to keep warfare away from civilians. This was a major reason why we did not win the war with Vietnam, because the North Vietnamese blended in with the civilians in South Vietnam. And they would recruit children to be basically human bombs. And the jungles of Vietnam were much different than the cold terrain of Korea and the more pastoral landscape of Europe. The Vietnamese had an extensive tunneling system underground. They had a I forget the name of it exactly, but they had basically a highway of transporting people and things from North to South Korea. We were not prepared for that kind of warfare after World War II and the Korean War. And guerrilla warfare a lot of times is not recognized as a government sanctioned type of warfare. Now we've moved into terrorism. And how is terrorism different? I got to get these in the right order. How is terrorism different? It is a specific type of violence that is basically, the purpose is to strike fear in people. The word terror is from the Latin word for fear. And so they will engage in specific types of violence like bombing, hijacking, kidnapping, biological attacks, things like this. Whereas in the guerrilla warfare, they're fighting using weapons like machine guns and grenades and things like that. These have different tactics. Terrorism has different tactics. Guerrilla warfare is usually targets military personnel. Terrorism a lot of times targets civilians. Think of 9/11, the airplanes being flown into buildings filled with civilians, as well as trying to fly a plane into the Pentagon. Both of them want to achieve a political goal. But terrorism is a lot of times carried out by sub-national groups. Again, this might be a group of certain kind of Muslims in the nation of Afghanistan. It's very much more complex, we could say. Other types of warfare that we can now talk about are cyber warfare. We're seeing this in our elections, where there is a warfare of other countries trying to affect the outcome of our elections. They're meddling. That's a cyber warfare, which includes all these other things. There is also biological warfare. After the 9/11 attacks, there were mailings sent in America with anthrax in them. Some people believe the coronavirus, COVID-19, was released on purpose by China. Not only released by China on purpose, but was created in a laboratory to be a biological warfare. Now, again, I'm not saying that's what happened, but a lot of people believe that. All right, the last section, which we're going to do very quickly here, is the economic dimension of national security. After World War II, not only were we the military superpower, but we were the economic superpower. Because we were separated by an ocean, none of our manufacturing plants and industries were destroyed. Europe was devastated. Japan had been hit by 2 nuclear bombs. There was damage in Russia because Russia was connected to Europe. So we emerged as the economic superpower, and we started giving aid to European countries to help them get back on their feet. But not only did it help those countries, it was helping us. As we were helping those countries rebuild their economy, we were also producing things in our factories and with our industries, because Europe wasn't producing them like they had. All of their plants had been destroyed. So not only were we helping them recover, but we were now producing the things that they needed. So they were buying products from us at a great rate. And after World War II, we just had an economic boom. Again, this is the large step of creating the middle class in America. So we basically were a unilateral, that is the only major economic superpower. Today, there are 3 major economic centers in the world. We are no longer the lone economic superpower. Along with us, there is the European Union, which contains, I forget how many countries now. It was 10, but there's more than that now, including Germany and France and England. And then the 3rd major economic superpower is near the Pacific Rim, or what's called the Pacific Rim Economic Center, which includes China and Japan. The United States makes up about 1/5 of the world's economy, the European Union about 1/4, and the Pacific Rim about 1/5. This is on page 522 of your textbook. Now, after the World War II, we provided foreign aid to help countries. And this has been a basic feature of our foreign policy ever since that time. We sent foreign aid to the nations that needed it the most, with the objective that it was going to help us too. As those countries improved their economies, as we engaged in free trade with other nations, which basically meant there were no tariffs, which is a tax on imports. We greatly reduced those tariffs, or we eliminated them. And this free trade helped other economies in other nations improve. As we expanded our foreign trade over the last 80 years, as we continued to assist developing nations, and as we protected international commerce. For example, our Navy has been protecting all commercial shipping lanes since the end of World War II. We patrol those waters so that goods and services are shipped from Europe to us, as well as from us to Europe and Asia and Africa. What we're doing there is we're protecting international trade. But what has happened in the last 2 decades is China has risen as the other superpower in the world. China has invested a lot of money in other countries, giving aid just as we do. China has built up their navy to also protect islands in the South China Sea. And so our efforts with economic policy have helped us, but in a way it's also hurt us, because now we are no longer basically the big man on the block, so to speak, when it comes to world economy. China is up there with us. And China has a lot of loans to us. We are in debt to China a lot. And so things have changed dramatically. But if you watched any of the debates or you have kept up with the news the last 4 years, one of the big things about Trump is that he basically was not going to let China dictate to us anymore. Trump was very aggressive in exerting U.S. strength against China, and that's been a point of contention in the U.S. political scene. But anyway, these are ways that we try to secure or protect our interests with the economy. Expanding foreign trade, assisting developing nations, and protecting the international commerce. So, any questions on chapter 17 before we talk about the test? So from chapter 17, you'll want to know the DIME acronym, which comes from the introductory section, and the 2 Ds, the DIME acronym, which is the 4 types of instruments we have for foreign policy, and know about the domino theory, which is in the first section. From chapter 16, I want you to make sure you read about the welfare policy. From chapter 15, know about the government as a promoter of business, agriculture, and labor. This is page 458 through 461 in my book, but it comes under the big section of government as promoter of economic interests. And then chapter 14, when it comes to the judicial system, under the big section, judicial power and democratic government, know about judicial review, judicial restraint, and judicial activism. I'll put a little brief study guide about these things up today, but those are the things you need to know for the final exam. It will be made available 9 o'clock Sunday night, and you'll have until 9 p.m. Wednesday night to finish it. So that's still 3 full days, but you'll get to start at 9 p.m. instead of midnight. Any questions?